This episode of Booked on Rock, the story of the first psychedelic neighborhood, the Haight-Ashbury counterculture movement of the 60s, how it began, the many whose belief built it, and its lasting impact almost 6 decades later. Welcome back, everyone, to Booked on Rock. I'm Eric Senich. I am very excited to have this guest on the podcast for the first time. He's an author, he's a historian, he's a music publicist. Dennis McNally. His books include On Highway 61, Music, Race, and the Evolution of Cultural Freedom, A Long, Strange Trip, The Inside History of the Grateful Dead, and Desolate Angel, Jack Kerouac, The Beat Generation in America. His brand new book is titled The Last Great Dream, How Bohemians Became Hippies and Created the 60s. Dennis, welcome to the podcast.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So to get the complete story of the San Francisco Haight-Ashbury scene, as you would call it, the world's first psychedelic neighborhood, we got to look back as far as the mid-40s. The book starts with the San Francisco poetry renaissance. So let's start there. Talk about the importance of poetry to the counterculture movement and the influence poets like Kenneth Rexroth and Robert Duncan had.
Of course, many people know that Allen Ginsberg first read Howl in San Francisco in 1955. And that sort of has taken the headlines, as it were. But what many people don't realize is that, of course, there was a really active poetry scene in San Francisco that people just really, got involved with. Many more than the two people I'm about to talk about, but, they were sort of the leaders and the starters. Kenneth Rexroth was a, very good poet. In particular, though, he was a leader in both teaching the idea that poetry should sort of come from the heart, which was very different from what was going on the East Coast at the time, which was a lot more measured and, irony and precision and not very inspirational. He was an advocate. He was basically an anarchist in a philosophical way, what they called personal politics, in which the personal is the political, so that you engage in politics from a moral rather than an ideological perspective. And that really was the root of the sort of bohemian or countercultural scene in San Francisco, starting really then. San Francisco always had a certain air of looseness about it, going back to the fact that it wasn't set up as a business thing, which is what most cities are. They start out, doing business. It was started by a bunch of crazy people who didn't fit in where they lived and charged off to find gold. And it had room for crazy in a way that most cities don't. So there was Rexroth, who, as I say, was quite political, and then his partner in crime. And it was very interesting because he was at least periodically homophobic, but his partner was a guy named Robert Duncan, who was very gay and to the point where he had actually come out in 1942, which frankly is, think about how remarkable that was. It was one reason why he's never ever gotten any kind of due again from the East Coast critics, who they wrote him off. So anyway, he came out of this very mystical, occult-oriented family. Literally, they were doing Rosicrucians and the Kabbalah and, all kinds of occult stuff, which it added a level of mysticism to the mix that Rexroth started. The first people that were, aside from the poets, who gathered around them, the first people that I can identify as being, they're outside of young poets, were the students at the San Francisco Art Institute, which was a remarkable place. When you think about the GI Bill, of course, you think about guys being able to buy homes and get better, go to college and get better jobs. But some of those vets wanted to go to art school after, 5 years of being in the Army or whatever, and, enduring what you had to endure. And they were great students. The new president of the school decided to leave the studios open all night so people could come in and paint when they wanted. And that's sort of evidence of a wonderful atmosphere. And they picked up on basically the ideology of Bohemia, which is simply that art comes before dollars and cents.
That's the California School of Fine Arts?
It was that, yes, I'm sorry.
Okay.
It later changed its name to the San Francisco Art Institute.
Okay.
It was the California School of Fine Arts, CSFA, and it was a fantastic place, and it produced a lot of interesting artists and interesting citizens.
Getting into chapter 3, it's titled Los Angeles and the Emigre. I was so fascinated with the story of Aldous Huxley's study of psychedelic drugs. This is where explore the subject of LSD and how it influenced the Haight-Ashbury neighborhood. Huxley is famous for his novel Brave New World from 1932, but he later wrote The Doors of Perception in 1954, which explored his experiences with LSD. Jim Morrison named The Doors after it. What inspired this, as you write, esoteric pursuit, and what were his findings after trying it?
Huxley was, sort of a cosmic explorer of everything at that point. He had written these novels critical of the way England's social theories were going. He became a pacifist, and he and some friends, fleeing World War II, frankly, left England and came to Los Angeles, partly for the sunshine, you know, and partly just they latched onto something that's very interesting about Los Angeles, in contrast to San Francisco, which was, for whatever reason, Los Angeles was from the very, very earliest, going back almost to the turn of the century, a warm landing place for unusual religious phenomena. The Theosophists, Gurdjieff, so forth, Vedanta. And they were around that, but his spiritual searches were, in every direction. And eventually, actually, I will, in a very minor correction, first he found psilocybin, which is derived from organic mushrooms. Later, what he wrote Doors of Perception about was actually psilocybin. And
Okay.
he had, well, to quote almost every hippie, he had a great trip. As he said, he had contacted there was a professor named Humphrey Osmond in Canada who was using LSD to treat alcoholism, which I might add now, 50 years later, there's a lot of interest in just that. Not LSD, psilocybin at that time, but he was interested in it as a medicinal thing. And Huxley, being infinitely curious, wrote him and said, let's talk. So the guy came to a meeting in LA and brought some and gave him some. And as he said, he was seeing what flowers looked like on the first day of creation. I might add, I just got really, not attacked, but, I got a very, very bad review from the Wall Street Journal because I don't, apparently to them, emphasize the risks of LSD. And there are definitely risks for some. For most people, out of, a million trips, all but 1,000 probably, people experience them, come back, and go, that's interesting. Because the one thing,
Cary Grant took LSD, right?
Cary Grant took it for his alcoholism.
Right.
So did the guy who owned Henry Luce and his wife Claire Booth Luce, who were very conservative people. Henry only did it once. Claire did it several times because her daughter died, and in her grief, she was looking for answers. And the one thing, to quote Jerry Garcia of the Grateful Dead, the one thing that you can absolutely guarantee, I think I can say this about LSD is after you've taken it, you realize that there's more going on than your day-to-day reality. Maybe good, it may be bad, but there's more. And that's what, basically, to boil down a brilliant man's 150-page essay into short, is there's more going on here. And that was the textbook that young people in the mid and late 50s started picking up on. At that time, of course, the LSD was controlled by a CIA program. This is not conspiracy theory. This is, really well documented stuff. And they were convinced that they could use it as a truth serum. Turns out, not so much. It was. But in the interval, it spread gradually, eventually getting, well, among other things, to Henry Luce, who put several articles in Time magazine and Life magazine, including a big story about the magic mushrooms of Mexico and a curandera there named Maria. I'm forgetting her last name. Apologize. And people started picking up on this. And eventually a guy named Tim Leary, who was a bored, sort of disappointed psychologist, got fascinated with this stuff, then progressed to LSD. And among other things, basically, he was convinced they were about to change the world, which may have been true, but his techniques, it's stuff I don't, I'm not a big Leary fan. He
Really?
he wrecked, yeah, he drew a lot of attention, made it look cute and funny, and created cute slogans like turn on, tune in, and drop out.
That's his phrase. Yeah.
Yeah, and he did that speaking to the New York Advertising Club. And it was like, what he and what most people who get into psychedelics see is a certain spiritual component. And what he was talking about wasn't spiritual at all. Among other things, he started talking about having, 10,000 orgasms, or I'm exaggerating, but, the sexual possibilities. And at any rate, my opinion doesn't matter.
Yeah. Was he trying to commercialize it?
He was trying to get attention,
Hmm.
as far as I can tell. No, I don't think it was that so much. It was just this sort of loose, showbizy approach to things instead of being, one of the other things that came out of that experiment was his associate, Richard Alpert, who wrote a really brilliant, serious book about psychedelics and reality called Be Here Now. And I'd recommend going in that direction. I mean, there's a lot of laughs behind LSD. There's no denying that. But that's not the only approach.
They talked about that with Manson, that he used LSD on the young women, the vulnerable young women. He'd have them take LSD when he was giving his speeches or his, I don't know
Absolutely.
what
And
you
and
would call it.
he was a monster.
Well, there are stories about him being connected to the CIA. That there's one author
I
who wrote a book
really,
about
Charles
that's
Manson was, some sandwiches shy of a full picnic.
right.
Even the CIA would take one look at him and go, no, no, no,
Exactly.
not somebody we can control. I
Yes,
don't think.
exactly.
I mean, he was known around he was in San Francisco briefly, and most of the people you talk to there who met him, he creeped them out. And unfortunately, the Squeaky and the young girls that he got to were manipulable, and he was a great manipulator.
Go back to the 50s and the radio station KPFA. You call it the most significant gift of the conscientious objector world to Bay Area culture. This seemed to be a great refuge from not just mainstream radio, but mainstream culture.
KPFA, the idea was that it was going to be to promote pacifism. What it ended up being, because there wasn't a large pacifist audience, and at this point, they're in between the official pacifists, or not pacifists, but basically the left wing in America, which at that point was mostly kind of Stalinist. It was do I mean, it was very difficult to cope with that and the standard American culture. So what they did was bring variety to American culture, a variety that was, you have to remember, after a depression and a war and the Cold War, the level of conformity and repression in the mid 50s in America was phenomenal. I did an interview with Michael McClure, who was one of the Beat poets, friend of Kerouac's, and I said, this was one of my first big interviews, and I said to him, why did On the Road, Jack Kerouac's book, have such an amazing impact? I mean, young people, everybody that you can think of in the 60s, from Dylan to David Bowie to Jerry Garcia to Janis Joplin, all of them read Kerouac and went, Shazam, And I said, but why, why? Why did it have such? And he just sort of looked at me and he said, Dennis, were you around in the 50s? I said, well, I was 10 when it ended. So he said, it was such a startling burst of energy and of sympathy for the spiritual. It wasn't obvious. You had to sort of see that, but it was there. And it's what turned people on.
KPFA doesn't really get mentioned all that much. I know KMPX, Tom Donahue, that's the famous radio station, counterculture station, San Francisco from the late 60s. But I didn't realize KPFA. I mean, that's an important radio station
It's a very
in the
important
history of radio. Yeah. That was FM, right? It was an FM only.
It was FM because they couldn't afford to get into the AM. The AM at that point, AM was much bigger, and people, they couldn't break in on getting a license. So they started small at FM, and what they did was bring alternative culture. So they brought, for instance, Alan Watts did a show on KPFA for 20 years talking about Buddhism and Zen and another world. Rex Roth did a show about left-wing politics and Buddhism, as a matter of fact. Pauline Kael developed her writing, her chops as a movie critic and ended up going to the New Yorker and being the best movie critic in American history, or among the great movie critics of American history. So there was all this stuff and music that you couldn't get anywhere else, serious music, whether it was classical or jazz or whatever.
Has there
It
ever
was,
been a documentary on KPFA or a book on KPFA? There
there
should
is a
be.
book, and if you go to the bibliography of my book, I could dig it up for you.
Yeah,
But yes, there's a very good book about
I'd
KPFA.
like to read it. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
All
Ginsberg
right.
read Howell on
And
KPFA,
later,
1957.
yes, yes, it was just a place where there was some freedom, cultural freedom, to talk about things. There was this unusual guy named Jaime D'Angelo who came to California just in time for the earthquake in 1906 and decided he was going to be a cowboy. And he ended up opening the first ranch, one of the first ranches in Big Sur, which is this fantastically beautiful area south of San Francisco. He later became a scholar of Native American languages and linguistics. And just before he died, they recorded him telling, he had written a bunch of Native American stories, which were real. I mean, he was a folklorist, a legitimate folklorist. And they decided that this would make something good for kids because they were like kind of kids' stories. Well, you weren't getting that on KMPX or any other normal radio station. And there was a richness to KPFA that only in San Francisco. And this is the time when I happened to watch Good Night and Good Luck just the other day, which is it's now on Broadway, this George Clooney play about Edward R. Murrow,
I heard
who
about this. They're going to
it's
be running it live on CNN.
and I urge you to watch it. It's he's wonderful, and Murrow was what I mean, wonderfully brave, taking on McCarthy in the same way that anybody who stands up to Trump now. I mean, the parallels are a little thick, but the point is that it was such a repressive time, and KPFA was like this like beacon of light in the wilderness.
And that poem, Howl, for those not familiar with it by Allen Ginsberg, basically celebrates the lives that fell outside, considered mainstream.
Exactly. I saw the best minds of my generation, and he literally started going through all the people he knew who had been hurt, had ended up in the loony bin, and whatever. And an attack on what he called Moloch, which was the ancient Hebrew eater of souls. What had happened was he took some peyote, and he was in this apartment on Nob Hill in San Francisco that looked down on this hotel that's still there, and near the top are these two odd windows. I've never, I should go up there and what are those windows to? Because they seem sealed. But anyway, they looked like, to him in his state of inebriation, they looked like the eyes of Moloch. And then about 3 months later, he sat down at a typewriter and started writing this poem about the howl and Moloch and a lot of other stuff. And it's a call for spirituality in America at a time when there really didn't seem to be any. And it had a number of things. One is that it's a brilliant poem and it really moves poetically. The other was that it had the greatest publicist in the history of poetry, namely the captain of the juvenile squad in San Francisco, a guy named Hanrahan, who decided to arrest the publisher, Lawrence Ferlinghetti, and his bookstore clerk, Shig Morrell, for obscenity because there's some dirty words in this poem. Well, as the Supreme Court had long said, redeeming social value is a reason to justify such things. And the judge immediately went, "This is BS," and threw it out. But the point is, everybody wants to see what the dirty words are. And it was tremendous publicity for Howell. And frankly, I would love to know the sales figures now, but I bet you they're still pretty good. And that's 50 years ago. But it's a landmark. Combined with Ginsberg's friend Kerouac's On the Road, suddenly the young people of America, along with rock and roll, and then along with folk music, which was itself very political, they started opening up to other possibilities.
Yeah, that's where you see, as you read the book, you start seeing everything coming together if we get
I
to
don't-
the mid to late 60s. Ginsburg, by the
oh,
way,
I don't-
wasn't he the guy that was after he took the peyote, he goes the next day, he was like working an office job and quit it. And he said to his therapist, I'm going to do something you're going to think is crazy. And the therapist says, what is it? And he says, I'm just going to quit my job and I'm just going to write about mankind and the human spirit, et cetera, et cetera. And the therapist is like, good for you.
Well, yeah, what the
Go for
therapist
it.
actually said was, "Why don't you?"
Why don't you?
He gave him permission, and that was a lovely thing.
Yeah, he
And
was from the East Coast initially and moved to San Francisco in
exactly,
54.
and that was when he found his persona. And he trails around this book from then to the end of the book because, among other things, he and the other beat poets were very much part of the biggest hippie thing, which was the being, the human being in Golden Gate Park, which, as I say, involved first the poets and then the rock bands, which sort of makes clear the connection of the progression of people going from beat to hippie.
Hey guys, thanks so much for checking out the Booked on Rock YouTube channel. If you've just discovered the channel, thanks for joining us. If you've been watching all along, can't thank you enough for your support. Make sure you tell a friend, a family member, share on social media, and also don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you get updates on latest episodes, video highlights, and more. Now back to the show. Let's talk about Kerouac some more. His 1957 novel, On the Road, it's about a young man traveling across America with his friend to better understand himself and the world. It depicts unconventional lifestyles and challenged societal norms. A high school art student at California School of Fine Arts named Jerry Garcia picked up a copy of the book at the famous City Lights bookstore in San Francisco. It's a literary landmark, and it played a big role in championing progressive and experimental literature. I'm a huge Jerry fan, huge Grateful Dead fan, so I'm fascinated with this. Jerry would follow the path of Kerouac and guitars the rest of his life. What was it about Kerouac, do you think, that really influenced Jerry so profoundly?
Well, let's go back a little bit. It's 1958. The book's still on the bestseller lists. He's 16 and he's taking art classes at CSFA from a guy named Wally Hedrick. Kind of my entire book is contained in a nutshell in this one story. So Wally, who is a very well-known beat, part of the beat painting scene, art scene, graphic art scene in San Francisco, is teaching weekend classes. And Jerry, among other things, he starts playing acoustic blues like Big Bill Broonzy while they're painting, which is why Jerry, when his mother gave him an accordion, said, "No, I want a guitar," which started him on his life path because that was his life and meditation from then on. Banjos too, but guitar. And then they say to Wally, as I say, is a well-known beat. What is this beat thing? What is everybody talking about? Because as I say, it's front page news at that point. And he says, "You guys are beat. Go down to City Lights, get this book. You'll see." And it was Jerry's Bible for the rest of his life. And the code is simply, the idea is pursue the spiritual, pursue love, pursue art. Don't worry too much about how much money you make or, so forth and so on. And Jerry believed that till the day he died. And
Yeah.
it affected me because umpteen years later, I sent him a copy of my biography of Kerouac. And, I think I did an okay job. But when I met him, he got very enthusiastic. And as I say, I did okay. But it was because of who it was about. Because Kerouac was his role model, his hero. And there was this energy there and a spirituality that Jerry completely got. And after a little while, he said, "Why don't you do us? Why don't you write a book about us, the Grateful Dead?" And I said, "Darn fine idea." And I started that. Eventually, I became the publicist, at which point I had to set it aside for another 10 years, because you can't be a publicist and a biographer at the same time. It's not kosher. So I, worked with them for a long time. And then after Jerry died, eventually I published the book.
Wow. So as a publicist for the Grateful Dead, I'm so curious as to your approach, because this wasn't like being a publicist for your average, regular, everyday rock and roll band.
Put it mildly. In some ways, I had the easiest job in the world. This is a band, almost any person who hires a publicist keeps saying, "Get me publicity, get me publicity." And these guys went, I'll tell you my training. So I got hired because the guy who had been publicist had gone away for his health. And the receptionist said, "What are we going to do about publicity? Nobody returns their calls and they're annoying me." Jerry said, "Get McNally to do it. He knows that stuff." Stuff was not the word he used, but I'll be glad. He said, "Send him up to my house and I'll tell him what he needs to know." So I sit down and he says, "Okay, first, we don't suck up to the press." And I swear to God, I think I might have written it down, but it don't suck up. And then he said, that's enough. Here, smoke this. And we hung out for the afternoon. That was my complete training. Now, eventually I pointed out to them by the middle 80s, I'm middle 30s. There's a lot of deadheads who had been in college like in the late 60s and early 70s, who by the 80s are now in positions of responsibility at the media, newspapers and TV. They want to cover the Grateful Dead, and they want to come. Well, the Grateful Dead always kept things in house. I said I should be on the road to keep these people out of your hair. And that's what it boiled down to. I went out to, among other things, protect the photographers from the crew, who were not always kind, and to just generally make it seamless. And that's what I did for the next 15 years. As I pointed out, if you're like Dylan and won't let them in, well, that's one thing. But if you're the Grateful Dead and you don't let the press, the TV in, what they're going to do, not because they want to mess with you, but because they have to have a story. It's a story. You're a story now. By the mid 80s, you are a definite story. You come to town and you see a bunch of tie-dye, you go, the Grateful Dead must be in town. I literally had friends do that and test it and find out, yep, I was in the room next door to him in the best hotel in Seattle, as a matter of fact. But they're going to go to the parking lot and they're going to see kids committing misdemeanors, maybe even felonies involving drugs or even beer. And they're going to get footage of that. Well, if you let them in and they shoot the band playing music with pretty lights, that's what they're going to use because these are people who are not looking to hurt. And we did fine, with the exception of after our big hit, which was called Touch of Grey, the only time the Grateful Dead had a top 10 hit. The problem was that a lot of kids most people who had become deadheads to that point had been brought up by maybe an elder sibling or just an elder friend. And they learned lessons about how you acted and how you behaved, as well as listening to the music, all of which involved remembering that, you were sort of like traveling gypsies and you needed to keep a smart profile. And that worked. But when these kids came, what they did was they said, "Oh, well, I'll go to the show anyway, maybe I'll get in." And then they get to the parking lot and they'd see a all-out party, which, any 19, 20-year-old is like, whoa. And we ended up having thousands of people without tickets outside our show, which we struggled with really until the day Jerry died, actually.
Yeah, it never. Oh yeah, it just got bigger and bigger. Well, your quote is so perfect in that documentary. What a long, strange trip it's been. It's in the first episode. A lot of distractions there, and I think I know what you meant, but the media would focus on a lot of the things like the tie-dye shirts and
Yeah.
whatever, all this different things. But you get past that, and there's a richness in that music. And it envelops you, as it does with myself and my older brother, and I'm looking at it, picture of Jerry right here. And there is a richness to that music that once
Absolutely.
you're in, it's just you feel like there's that warmth of it, and you just never want to
Well,
leave.
the Grateful Dead did two things. First, they weren't a rock band. They were a jazz band, an improvisational jazz band that happened to use rock instruments and rock song structures. But the improvisation was everything.
Phil Lesh's
Improvisation,
quote: "Collective improvisation."
that's right. And improvisation is like jumping off a cliff. You can land on the ground on the rocks, and it's called a train wreck in music speak. Or sometimes you fly, and the Grateful Dead flew often enough. The audience went along for the ride, and that was the magic that brought them in. The other was that they actively fostered, although it was the Deadheads that created it, as Jerry, who's always ready to duck responsibility. He didn't, it's not my fault. You guys are Deadheads because you're Deadheads because you chose that. But the point is that they created a community, and the Deadheads embraced that. I never saw, I am trying, the only time I ever objected to anyone's behavior inside a concert was an unusual woman whose name I won't share, who would neigh like a horse. She'd sort of jump up and down and neigh very loudly. And she was standing right in front of me. And at intermission, I looked at her and I said, listen, it was the only time I've ever had to do this. I went to 1,000 shows, mostly because they paid me to. And I mean, I was able to do that because I was paid. And I finally broke down and said, I'm sorry, you're just going to have to go somewhere else. You're ruining the show. You're louder than the band. This just is not acceptable. The one thing you can't do is interfere with somebody else's trip. And she went and said something mean to me, but, left. And the entire section around me started applauding. Okay. I wasn't the only one bumming out because of her. So that was, as I say, I went to a lot of shows, and that was the only time I ever felt compelled to complain about anybody.
Well, that's my question. One last question before we move on and get back to the book. But Jerry Garcia, is he the person that he appears to be? Fun-loving, sweet guy, humble, big kid? Because
Not just. I mean, he was all those things.
And more.
And a lot more. I mean,
intelligent.
Among other things, incredibly intelligent, empathic, very curious about other people. That's why people love to do interviews with him, because they were conversations and not him selling merchandise, which is what most rock and roll interviews are about. And also very sensitive. And when he lost, for instance, his ability on the road to take a walk because people would be hitting on him, or go to a museum, ditto, that hurt. It was too much. And that's why eventually he turned to, self-medicating himself with various drugs. And I might add, but remember, what he died of was a heart attack because he didn't take care of himself, because he didn't wanna, and he just sort of put his foot down. So every guy over 40 has to realize that you got to, at least watch your diet a little and exercise a little, and
he tried.
And occasionally he'd try, and then he'd slough off.
Yeah. His fascination with Frankenstein. What an interesting guy.
Well, it brought him in touch with a whole new world. That was his first movie. It was a great story. I heard from the American Movie Channel had a show called The Movie That Changed My Life. And he was diabetic, and this is in the last year of his life, and he was like down, and he wouldn't be running around yelling at people, but he'd have a little dark cloud around his head, and you'd say hi and then shut up. I mean, but then I got this request from them, and I said, I went in to see him, and I said, I think I've got one for you. And he said, okay. And I told him, and he immediately started doing the interview. That experience of introducing him to this whole other world was just one of the favorite memories of his life.
Find the Booked on Rock website at bookedonrock.com. There you can find all the back episodes of the show, the latest episode in video and audio, plus a video highlight and a link to our YouTube channel. Links to all of the platforms where you can listen to the podcast, plus all the social media platforms. We're on Blue Sky, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and X. Also, check out the Booked on Rock blog, find your local independent bookstore, find out all the latest hot rock book releases, and before you go, check out the Booked on Rock online store. Pick up some Booked on Rock merch. It's all at bookedonrock.com. There was the emergence of rock and roll in England around 1964, but around that time in San Francisco, folk music is prominent. In fact, you write about how many of the later San Francisco musicians, like Jerry Garcia, got their start playing folk music, but folk initially sprang up in Los Angeles, and eventually it would lead to the genre known as folk rock. The Byrds play a huge role here.
There's a fascinating article by a rock critic in the Los Angeles Free Press, which describes the Byrds, a scene when the Byrds were playing at Ciro, their first big run. And clearly this guy had been psychedelicized. You can't read the article without assuming that. And he's attributing that to the audience, which in 65 is pretty early to outside of the Bay Area, because the guy who was making the LSD was in the Bay Area. But all I can say is the Birds, and of course 8 Miles High, gave major hints of all that. Although in the end, as the improvisation to the, all the way out to the end of the universe became the calling card of the Bay Area.
Dennis McNally is the author of The Last Great Dream, How Bohemians Became Hippies and Created the 60s. Let's talk about Jefferson Airplane now in the year 1965, an important year in Haight-Ashbury history. This is when Jefferson Airplane forms.
They formed, again, as a kind of a folk rock. I mean, I don't know necessarily. Yeah, I would say by then, certainly Marty Balin, who formed the band, had heard the Byrds and was picking up on that vibe. And so he started this folk rock band with Paul Kantner. He spotted Paul Kantner also playing folk, and they said, let's start a band. Post Beatles, every folkie said, this rock and roll stuff looks like fun. And everybody's, they started forming sort of rock bands. But what was important with the Airplane, frankly, and their musical quality was Kantner had a friend by the name of Jorma Kaukonen, who was a great guitarist. And eventually, Jorma called in his buddy Jack Cassidy, who was a great, great bass player, so that Jefferson Airplane had more guts, shall we say, than your average folk rock band. And eventually, of course, with Grace Slick, they created the first sort of the psychedelic message that came out of San Francisco and hit all of America. And it was straight because at that point, the coverage by the media was the media just didn't get what was going on. You were talking about the TV people earlier. Well, it was worse in 1967 when you have all these very straight reporters who have all they see is kids experiencing voluntary poverty, getting high, having fun, talking about love, and not caring about what they're supposed to care about, which is, money and achievement. And the reporters just didn't get that. The one message that did come out was in the spring, White Rabbit flooded the country. And as Grace Slick will tell you, the last lines, feed your head, wasn't just about drugs. It was all the ways you can feed your head. And it was about literature, and it was about other music, and so forth and so on. It was a universal message. Granted, the kids leap to other conclusions. And that's one of the reasons why everybody wanted to come to San Francisco in the summer of 67.
January 22nd, 1966, the Trip Festival in San Francisco. Talk about that and its impact.
So in the fall of 65, so Ken Kesey of the so-called Merry Pranksters had written a brilliant, brilliant book called One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Did fantastically. Wrote a second book and decided to celebrate it, as it were, by taking a bus full of his buddies, the great bus ride, across the country to New York for the publication. And by the time he got back, they had been filming and they were going to make a movie. He didn't really want to write anymore. Writing is slow and difficult and so forth and so on. It's work. And he wanted a more direct communication of what he was seeing out of the value of the LSD experience. So they're going to make a movie, except they were all tripping when they filmed the movie, which meant that half the film stock was out of focus. Not so good. So he ended up saying, okay, we'll have a party. And they called it the acid test. The first one had 50 people. The last one, the Trips Festival, had 5,000, which should tell you something about the momentum of what was going on in the Bay Area in late 65 and then up through January of 66. And it's very interesting because the Grateful Dead sort of stepped out onto the stage, and what they did worked with the LSD, and the place just took off into heaven. But you didn't have to be tripping to know this, to understand this, because in fact, Ralph Gleason, who was the jazz critic and the rock critic of the Chronicle, San Francisco Chronicle, a diabetic who completely sober, got it too. There was something about the atmosphere and the presence of loud. There's some connection between loud music and the way it goes through your body. I mean, electronic, really loud, and LSD. It makes you sensitive to it, and it makes it an amazing experience. And it was for everybody there. And one of the people in Haight-Ashbury said that everybody in the Haight-Ashbury was born at the Trips Festival, that they were there and they got it. And what had happened was that the US government, in its infinite wisdom, was going to build freeways all across San Francisco, including right past the Haight-Ashbury through digging up Golden Gate Park so that you could get to Marin County faster, north the Golden Gate Bridge faster. Well, fortunately, the neighborhood said, and they managed to have it canceled. But in the interval, the property values of Haight-Ashbury were like at rock bottom. So it was an expensive neighborhood to have a revolution in. For $30 a month, you could get a room. For $50 a month, you could get an apartment. I mean, people could find, 5 people could put together $10 a month and have a place to live. Nice. And experience what was going on. So the Haight-Ashbury was this test laboratory for what would happen if a bunch of very high people hung out and experimented with drugs, but with sexual behaviors, with all kinds of things. One of the things that people, I don't think, have acknowledged is one of the things that came out of the Haight was the image of the gentle male hippie. And to the best of my knowledge, that was the first time that gentleness in a man was celebrated in American culture. As far as I'm concerned, it led in just a few years to the emergence of the really powerful gay subculture in the Castro. And later, we now have reached the point where we have the federal government harassing and trying to dismiss the lives of trans people. And I think it all connects back. I teach occasional high school classes of kids that are fascinated with the 60s. And what I tell them is the reason I'm telling you, or I'm telling them, why you're interested in, but I'll tell you why I think you're interested in it, which is simply none of the things that came out of the Haight-Ashbury, whether it's organic food, yoga, Zen, the gentle, challenges to sexual stereotypes, none of that's gone away. Haight did not have any impact on American politics, although it did help end the war, but it certainly had an impact on American culture. And it's still there. And the questions that it raised are still being challenged. And unfortunately, from my opinion, in a completely negative way by the current administration. But that's another issue.
Ballroom posters to promote concerts were and still are a thing of beauty. We've all seen them. It originates in San Francisco. From the beginning, these were cherished as art objects. People would tear them down. You say in the book, tear them down almost as soon as they went up. Talk about how this began. Promoters Bill Graham, legendary Bill Graham, his place in this story, and who's responsible for the first one.
So Bill Graham was this wannabe actor who then found his niche in concert promotion. Also a guy named Chet Helms who had the Avalon. So Bill had the Fillmore and Chet had the Avalon. And the thing about San Francisco is, particularly at that point, is that it's not that big a place. And a poster was a very effective communications means. And relatively speaking, very inexpensive for the promoters. And if you put 10 up on Haight Street and a couple of more in North Beach and a couple of more on Telegraph Avenue in Berkeley, shazam, the word would get around. So it was a very effective communication device. What you can't exactly explain is that the leading, what we call the Big Five, Mousen Kelly, Wes Wilson, Victor Moscoso, and Rick Griffin, were fantastic artists who, liberated by LSD and some prior training, they all had some training. I mean, Moscoso, I think he had an MFA from Yale, and deriving their work from a number of things, including Art Nouveau, but also the acid experience. They used to call the first posters boxing posters because they were just, name, picture, ugly, I mean. And very quickly, they started expanding their imagination, sometimes to Bill Graham's regret, because they would get into doing this very difficult to read lettering. And he'd say, I want people to know where the show is. And they'd say, they'll study. And they did. And it worked, it sucked people in. And yes, I mean, they're collector's items to this day.
Underground publishing in San Francisco, among the many important stories told in the book. Chapter 30 gets into the newspaper The Oracle, which first published in 1966. What was the mission of The Oracle?
The Oracle was edited by a poet, which will tell you something, and an art director by the name of Michael Bowen, who was out of the Surrealist school of painting. And it was to spread the message of peace, love, and psychedelics. Some of it was, I'm not much on astrology, so some of it was kind of, to me, gibberish. But also, the poet Gary Snyder wrote an essay on Buddhism in the Western world that was one of the best essays ever, on that subject ever written. So, you got a lot of stuff in there, and it presented a lot of information, and it was incredibly successful for a year. And then what happened, among other things, as Peter Berg points out, is that the San Francisco Police Department, at the end of the Summer of Love, by then, the San Francisco Police Department had turned Haight Street into a one-way speedway where nobody could, just sort of hang out, and installed crime lights to make it, deliberately ugly, really, so that it was no longer a very nice place to hang out.
And the sharpest critics of the Oracle were the Diggers. Who were the Diggers?
The Diggers were former actors from the mime troupe who were very political, not in an exactly overt way, but specifically, explicitly anti-consumer. And they talked about free. So they got, sometimes stole, sometimes mooched food, which they cooked and gave to people, not to be social workers, but on the principle that everybody should be able to eat. And they advocated that, and they disliked the Oracle because the Oracle was sort of supported by the stores, which sold trinkets and this is in the clothing and, stuff. And they wanted to warn that anything that can be sort of captured by the corporate culture, blue jeans, will be. If you can make money on it, that's their job, the corporate. And that they objected to. And they were overly optimistic, shall we say, that everybody would basically try and reject money and live communally and live in a very low-cost way. But their point was real enough. And it's taught us all a lot of lessons.
You mentioned the human being. Let's go back to that. January 14th, 1967. That's held at Golden Gate Park Polo Fields. Tell me if I'm in the ballpark here. Reading about this, it made me think about when Touch of Grey became a hit and the longtime Dead fans were now surrounded by the younger fans who they didn't feel fit the vibe. Yeah, you say it was the beginning of the end of the Haight as a functional neighborhood.
The Haight through 1966, was completely under the radar, virtually completely under the radar, effectively under the radar. And they did a lot of, they experimented, they had fun, it worked. So they decided to throw a party. Why not? Let's celebrate. And they celebrated at the B-Inn. The problem with the B-Inn was that somewhere between 30 and 50,000 people showed up. The entire police department presence at the B-Inn was 2 cops on mounted horses. They, I don't, it's one of the mysteries. Well, they obviously got caught by surprise. They certainly didn't expect that many people. And it went fine, at least until they started arresting people as they streamed out. Some people were walking in the street on Haight Street and, obstructing traffic, you're arrested. But the point is that it blew their cover. And after that, the entire spring was filled with, people covering the media story. And as I say, mostly getting it all wrong or just trivializing it, making it, more superficial than it was, with the basic message that come summer, every bored high school kid in America, that would be just about everybody, was going to come to San Francisco. And I've never gotten an accurate count, and I don't think anybody ever did, of how many tens of thousands of people did come to San Francisco that summer, but it was too many. And it was a lot of young kids without emotional or financial or life quality sophistication. So that instead of contributing, they were dependent. Feed me, give me a place to sleep.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah.
And it was hard. And people like the Diggers and there was a wonderful church called All Saints Church in the Haight that did the same thing and just went completely batshit trying to take care of these kids. But instead of being then a celebratory neighborhood, it was a neighborhood struggling with a problem.
All good things come to an end, and that was the sign that this is starting to come to an end. The high water mark, though, was the Monterey International Pop Festival. See, the high water mark of what happened in the Haight would be the splendid June weekend of the Monterey International Pop Festival. Now, throughout the book, you delve into the music that was emerging and happening in Los Angeles and London, as well as San Francisco. This is where all three connect, and it's the first American performance of the Jimi Hendrix Experience. This event comes together in response to police riots in the fall of '66 on the Sunset Strip.
Which eventually becomes the project of a guy named Lou Adler, who is the record company president for the Mamas and the Papas, who were very popular in L.A., and John Phillips,
John Phillips,
the leader of Mamas and the Papas. And they start this nonprofit. They change it into a nonprofit, and they bring actually four cities, because also New York. And what became quickly obvious was that it was a celebration of psychedelic music. Be a hippie, bring bells, bring flowers, etc. And the fact is that the capacity of the arena where Monterey took place was 7,000 people. There were probably 30,000 people on the grounds of the fairgrounds. Now, any other time, this would have caused a heart attack in the cops, and in general created major problems. Let's put it that way. Nothing happened. The cultural image of hippie and the summer of love is of beautiful people with flowers in their hair, listening to great music, very high, very happy, very peaceful. And for 4 days at Monterey, it really was true. By Saturday, it was Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and by Saturday afternoon, the chief of police of Monterey was sending half of his cops. He called out when they saw what was about to happen. They'd called every cop, within 100 miles, I suppose, out, and they said, "Go home. Nothing's
how about
happened."
that? Wow.
And my favorite picture, which is the next to the last picture in my book, is a picture of a police officer, a motorcycle police officer, stringing. Yeah, take a look.
Let me look for it here.
Every seat in the arena had a flower on it, an orchid. They'd shipped in 10,000 orchids from Hawaii, and this motorcycle cop is stringing orchids on the antenna of his motorcycle with a big smile on his face, because he has absolutely nothing to do, which is the way we like police to be there, standing there looking at kids and going, "Nothing to see here." And that's the story of Monterey in that picture.
That says it all.
Yep.
I'm looking for the photos here. Unless the preview copy doesn't have photos, I'd be bummed.
I'm sorry, you're right.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, you obviously got a
I got
galley.
yep.
The galley. I'm sorry, you were robbed.
That's okay. It's all the more reason for me to buy a copy.
Well, there you go. But
There you go.
let's see if
You have it
this.
there?
I was going to say, let's see if this will come through at all. Let's see. That's the
Yeah,
picture.
you could see it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there you go.
Oh, there. Yeah. Oh, wow, look at that. And he's smiling.
Oh yeah.
That guy went in there probably with a serious look on his face, like I'm ready to go to battle.
That's right. And
That's beautiful.
there was a certain amount of magic at Monterey.
The story about Hendrix, the photographer from San Francisco, Bob Seidman, the story he remembered, he sees Hendrix. He looks like he's in no shape to get on stage.
To stand up. He
Right.
had, Jimmy was the kind of guy that if you offered him a handful of hits, he'd take them all. And he did, and was like he looked like crumpled laundry. And then the roadies, they were taking bets that he wouldn't play. And then the roadies came and got him, and he went out, and he was Jimi Hendrix.
A truly heroic metamorphosis.
Absolutely. And he summed up everything that had been going on in however long he played.
Well, people talk about Woodstock, how important that is. In your opinion, Monterey, I mean, like you're right, for 4 days at Monterey, it was reality, and it colored the next decade and more of the youth culture.
And, on any number of levels, there was a VIP row with every important record company executive were sitting there. And they all, Clive Davis and Warner Brothers, they all took their cues from what they saw that weekend. You had sort of soft rock stuff from LA, which got a certain amount of attention. And then you had San Francisco and Jimmy, and there you go.
If you could bottle that. and sell it. But then it'd be commercialized. We don't want to sell it.
No.
But no, it was a magical time. It was like that magical time that came and went. Must have felt like it went so fast because time goes by so fast. I mean, we read about that era, and it seems like a long time. But boy, it was 5 years.
Well, I mean, the
Not
magic
even really.
stuff was, was really, a year.
Yeah.
A year and a half, 2 years, say. And I cheated, that's why I ended at Monterey at a high point, because not always for bad, but things got much more complicated. And it diversified. It went out into one of the people who was one of the light show people, a guy named Roger Hilliard, later went to Boston, and he and a guy named Paul Hawken, you may have heard of Smith and Hawken, which is a fairly well-known series of stores, created Erewhon, which was one of the first distributors of organic food in America. And it grew until, I don't know what, many billions of dollars industry now. And that's just one of the things. But to go into that, to go into where the music business went, to go into the war, that's another 3 books, and I only had time for one.
Right. The Last Great Dream, How Bohemians Became Hippies and Created the 60s. It's out now, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's out now.
All your better bookstores.
All right. You can find it wherever books are sold. Look for it at your nearest bookstore. If you have an independent bookstore, look for it there. You can go to bookedonrock.com to find your nearest independent bookstore. And if they don't have one there, ask them to get a copy. Demand they get a copy. And where can people find you online, Dennis?
DennisMcNally.com. It's not very original, but there I am. And you can, among other things, there's a bunch of, not just Amazon, but a bunch of places where you can go online and buy the book if you like.
And you did this interview from beautiful San Francisco.
Yeah.
How long have you lived there?
Cold. I've lived here forever. I came here when I researched my first book in 1974 and came back 2 years later. Here I am. But I got to say, it's a wonderful summer day in San Francisco. It's about 50 degrees and foggy, and the wind's blowing. So, if you're coming to visit San Francisco, bring layers.
Yeah. All right. Dennis, thank you so much. It's so great to have you on the show. I hope to have you back on again someday down the road.
Be happy to. You take care.